Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome along to another night of history, shore ain't boring in Loxton. My name is Trevor Filkey and I am the coordinator of tonight's event, along with my fellow coordinators, Rose Morby, Rob Lehman and Kathy Schliebs. South Australian History Festival began across the state last Saturday and continues throughout the month of May. We're delighted that this night is part of Loxton's contribution to the festival in South Australia. It is run under the banner of the Loxton Waikerie Council, and we are indebted for their support. A special welcome to our guest speakers tonight. In order of presentation, Jeff Drogamella, John Gladigo and Peter McGarry. Then a few thank yous to the fellow coordinators in Robert Lehman, Rose Morby and Kathy, to the Loxton Waikerie Council, Sue Schultz and the front desk staff, the Loxton Public Library, to Karen Rubarth and her fellow librarians. I'd like to acknowledge all media outfits, especially Steph Thompson, Loxton journalist for the Murray Pioneer, Matt Stevens from 5MV, Radio's Life FM and 5RM. The helpers here tonight, and Des and Kathy and Chris Kimber and Lorraine Filkey. The venue, the Loxton Sporting Club, which again is a wonderful venue to have an evening like this, and I acknowledge the fine support that we get from the manager here in Paul Campbell. And I'd like to thank you also, Sam, and also to Rowan for recording and filming of tonight's proceedings. As is usually with a night like this, the format will be fairly similar to what we've had 2 years ago, because last year was cancelled. Each speaker will have 25 minutes. A warning bell will be rung 2 minutes prior, allowing them to wind up their talk. And after the completion of the second speaker, we'll have an opportunity to stand up and stretch. There won't be a question time, but I'm sure each speaker will be happy to chat with you informally at the end of the evening. Please feel free to stay and mingle at the conclusion of tonight's event. We'll then move straight on with our speakers, and it gives me much pleasure to call to the stage our first speaker in Jeff Drogamella. I'll introduce Jeff as he's coming forward. Jeff was born at the Loxton Hospital on May the 1st, 1944. The only son and second child, a sister, Jill being born earlier, of the late Merv and Melva Drogamella. He was raised on a family farm at Yincanny, not far from Marook. He attended Marook Primary School and Loxton Area School and completed his schooling at the then new Loxton High School. After completing his education, he worked on his parents' farm at Yincanny, growing cereals and running sheep for meat and wool production. During that time, he also helped establish a citrus orchard on the property where he is still living today. In 1967, Jeff wanted to travel overseas to see other parts of the world. Along with a mate, he hitchhiked from India to London, through the Middle East and numerous countries in Europe. After he returned, he continued working on the family farm and orchard. Jeff is married to Yvonne and they have 2 sons. Jeff has contributed and still does to the Marook community, serving on numerous committees in the town. He's a past member of APEX and the CFS and currently is involved with Probus and is an active JP. In his earlier years, he played football and tennis and coached some junior table tennis. After living in the Marook area for most of his life, Jeff is well versed in the history of the area, and we look forward to the presentation, An Early Village to a Thriving Township, the history of Marook from settlement to the present. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Drogamella.
Thank you very much for your applause. I hope I can live up to the introduction I've been given. Obviously, I don't do a lot of this. So, nerves, yeah, I've got a lot of them, but I'm not going to show them tonight. I'm hopefully going to give you an overview of how Marook was started, which we could say is the northern satellite suburb of Loxton, I guess. It goes back a long, long time. So without any further ado, I found I was worried about this because history, to get to the nuts and bolts of it, there's a lot of dates in that, and I might bore you, but I think I've got to give it to you, and I'll try to be a bit lighter towards the end of the speech, if I possibly can. So I've just tried to use up some of my 25 minutes. The Moorook history. The Aboriginals named it Moorook, Big Bend in the river. The Big Bend is noticeable as it ends the longest straight stretch, 7 miles, in the River Murray on its 1,600 miles or 2,576 kilometres of meandering. Moorook is 250 miles or 450 kilometres by river from the Murray mouth. In June 1890, I'm going back a fair way, and I can't remember this because I wasn't around then, but I'm quoting this from Joan Wachtel's book, A Bend in the River, on the history of Moorook. So thanks to Auntie Joan, and I really appreciate being asked to do this because I think it's a service to her. She was a wonderful auntie, married to Fred Wachtel. She was a lovely woman, but she did spend a lot of time on this, so I'm so happy to be able to deliver a little bit of it to you. Yeah, in 1890, this series of events happened. It started with a shipping strike. In 91, there was a shearers' strike. In 1892, a lockout of the workers on the BHP company. 1983, a bank crash. By 1894, a depression was deeply entrenched. The government of the day had to face these problems of drought, low prices for produce and unemployment amongst people in Adelaide. They decided to test a radically new idea to put people on the land by forming a socialistic communities. An Act of Parliament was proclaimed. This adventure was advertised and 20 families handed their names in to become members of this new community. They were mainly from the Port Adelaide area. They took up the challenge and travelled by rail from Adelaide to Morgan. A short walk to the wharf gave them their first sightings of the mighty River Murray. They embarked on the PS Gem, which is still on display in Echuca. I hope I'm right there. It's either Echuca or Swan Hill, I'm not quite sure. I do not know how long the voyage was, but it was reported that it birthed at Moorook on the 20th of May, 1894, and it was just on dusk. If ever you've been camping and you arrive with your family just on dusk, it's not nice. So these poor people had to disembark from the Gem. There had been no preparations for their arrival. They had to scramble up the bank, their future quite unknown. They lit fires to cheer their children up, or themselves. They boiled water for Billy tea, which tasted just so good. Just think how they felt. The nearest doctor was at Renmark, 30 miles away, on the other side of the wide river. The nearest hospital was Kapunda, days away. Overland Corner was 17 miles downstream by a river on the opposite side, and their postal address for all upriver mail came through there. Overland Corner's victorious era was drawing to a close. In that year of 1894, the police station closed its doors for the last time. The hotel licence had expired in 1891. There were rabbits, kangaroos, wild fowl, ducks and fish for the taking. But they had not been warned about the flies, mosquitoes and snakes. I can just feel what they're on about. A meeting of males elected a chairman who was responsible to the government. The government set up a store of supplies of flour, tea, sugar, salt and pepper and molasses. the settlers were given coupons to the value of 7 shillings and 1 penny per week. They handled no money. The government sold the produce and credited it to the settlement. This to some at first would have been very stimulating, bringing each man's ingenuity, providing his own food, shelter, starting to grow firstly vegetables, then fodder to feed horses, cows, sheep and goats. It gave a strengthening sense of purpose for the men who had been without jobs for many a year. Few women, however, care to share their kitchens, be it community bread baking or early morning turn at water carrying or to do the washing. Lack of privacy, discomfort soon shattered ideology. Unhappy women made unhappier men. The government provided equipment for pumping water to irrigate the new crops. They found the River Clay a challenge. Once wet, it would stick to everything, but that's why they had come to grow food. The land settlers took up was about 100 metres up from the current Moorook shop towards Loxton, if you can sort of picture that. And it extended from there down past the bowling club and beyond. The pump was positioned to draw water from the entrance to Yatco Lagoon. If you all remember, as you're driving through Moorook, Yatco Lagoon goes straight off to the left and the river curves around slightly it goes straight on and the river curves around slightly to the left. There was a reason why that happened. And it's very near where, if any of you remember where the Gogol homestead was, which is still standing, the settlers took up land on the west side of the lagoon and of the river. The communal system only lasted about 7 years, mainly due to disconnect amongst the families and how the debt to the government would be repaid. Some left, some stayed. The ones who stayed leased the land from the government and continued to grow food, but they would retain the money from the produce. The government surveyed the land in the early 1900s, mainly in lots of 10-acre blocks. Most people took up 2 by 10-acre allotments. One allotment to grow produce, the other to hold animals such as a draft horse or draft horses, cows, sheep, etc. Most of the blocks had a gentle eastern slope, which proved to grow good produce. As the area grew, the first pump could not supply enough water, so another pump was sourced and it was positioned next to where the present pumping station is today. The first 2 pumps were driven by steam engines, which used an enormous amount of wood to fire the boilers to produce that steam. The wood was supplied by the early dry land settlers who came there to clear the land and plant wheat. In some cases, this was their only income. And something I found amazing, it would take about 80 tonnes of wood to fire the boilers for a 24-hour stint. That's a lot of wood. The settlement started before locks were built, and river flows would vary from floods to no flow. A stone wall was built across the entrance to Yatco Lagoon to hold water back so they could pump water continually. From almost in front of where the Moorook shop still stands to the point across the river to the Yatco, the other side of Yatco, the wall went on a diagonal thing and was built up quite well, and that could hold it back. We've tried to find that on our GPS in the boats, but that's long gone. At the end of World War I, the land was made available for returned soldiers. This extended Moorook to the north, or near Batham's Road, which starts near the entrance of Wachtel Lagoon and heads west. This venture was only partly successful as the ground had only minimal slope and frost was a problem. Some left and took up land in Monash. The first school was held in a room at the back of the hall. Then a new school was built on Wachtel Road in about 1927. The railway came to Yinkanni in 1925. The line was planned to continue to Barmera, but would you believe money ran out at Yinkanni? All goods from the surrounding area had to be delivered by truck to the Yinkanni siding, which kept the transport companies very busy. Over years, population has varied. At the start, each blocker had a permanent man, and then tractors replaced draft horses. So not so much labour was required. But then along came the cooperative packing houses, one at Moorook, another one at Kingston, and so the town seemed to grow. At one time, Moorook could boast 2 general stores owned by Consolkis and Kilgores, and a supermarket in the co-op, a post office, a bakery owned by Doug Haddam and then Gordon Obst, and a butcher owned by the Shervick family. Some of the legends of Moorook. Nippies, the biggest employer in Moorook, started their citrus growing business in about 1938. They transported their own produce to Adelaide Market, and as their business grew, they purchased other growers' fruit and packed that and sold it to market for them. Their company extended into fruit juicing and has kept growing into what it is today. They have a factory in Moorook, a packing shed in Waikerie, and a juicing plant in Adelaide. The Kozolki family owned the general store, which had a liquor licence for many years. Missy Kozolki passed away recently and is sadly missed. Her late husband, Norm, who passed away many years ago, was quite a legend. He ran the store with Missy and also ran wheat stacks in Yinkanni and Wilpilka. I guess some of you can remember the old wheat stacks. You used to have some in Loxton too. After selling their store, they started a transport business operating between Moorook, Melbourne, Adelaide, Moorook. The Heinzel family also had a transport business, Adelaide to Adelaide and back to Moorook daily, plus local transport. The Villas family did a lot of general carting and also had a fuel round. The mechanical side of things was handled by G.W. Hall, or Glenn Hall as he was known, and W.R.S. Munn, or Billy Munn. That's Steve Munn's dad. In 1964, the local community raised funds to form a community club at Moorook, which is still operating today. Sport has played an important part of our history, but like most towns, we have been struggling to fill teams, but still have an active tennis club and lawn bowls. Housing land has been available recently. Rob Cordy's Stage 1 development has been sold out and Stage 2 is about to start. Nispels have sold out Stage 1 of their housing development and are working on Stage 2. Moorook Riverfront, which up till about 1962 was a bit of a rubbish dump. It is now a picture and very popular camping and skiing place for young and old. Thanks must go to the council for the maintenance of the area and also the many hours put in by local volunteers. Over many years, the Moorook Tree Planters Group have planted many local native trees to revegetate Moorook. The first project was to plant trees around the cemetery. With the help of the primary school children, and that was a lovely day. We had all the aunts and uncles came along and they sat on the graves where their parents were buried and talked to the little grandkids. There was such a trust between little kid and grandma and granddad. It was beautiful. We then went on, or the tree planters went on to plant the avenue of trees on the northern entrance to Moorook. If you notice that coming back from Kingston, you've got 4 rows of trees on the Wachtel's Lagoon side. Centenary Park on the riverbank was planted in 1994, and around the effluent pond, when that was built, there was more trees put around that. The improvements go on with a local government grant to build a walking trail. It's hoped that we can connect Moorook and Kingston, mostly along the river. And thanks again to the Council and the Moorook Kingston Community Association, that's underway. It's been going for about 1 year, and hopefully this year we'll almost complete that project. New housing developments have attracted many new people to the area, and it's a great place to live, and it's a get up and go community. And I'm very proud to be one of those people. Just to extend on a couple of points that I've mentioned, Mr. Nispel sticks out as a great legend of Moorook. When he was in his school break, he lived in Tanunda at Marananga, I think it was, the family came from. He'd ride his bike up to Moorook and pick apricots, oranges, whatever was going. Then him and his couple of friends who worked on nearby orchards, they'd get together after they knocked off, ride down to the Moorook shops, jump in the river, swim around Moorook Oval, shake themselves up on the bike and run back home and cook some tea. They did that every night. That's quite a big swim. I asked Mr. Nispel one day, luckily I had the pleasure to meet him and talk to him quite a lot. I said, Mr. Nispel, have you ever thought about making your fruit block organic? Boy, it is organic. But you use sprays? No, I wear out 4 faux heads a year, chipping out the weeds. That was his idea of being organic. He was a very hard man, ran a very tough business, brought up his kids to think the same way, and that hasn't hurt any of them. They've been very, very successful in creating a bigger empire. And now it's back to young Ben who's taking over at Moorook, and he's doing an excellent job. It'd be amiss if I didn't mention Norm Kozolki. Lucky enough, I was a young kid growing up when Norm was running the wheat stacks in Yinkanni and Wilpilka. Norm, as most of you would know, was a soldier. He was a prisoner of war, and he worked on the Burma railway line. When he came back, he was just a pencil man, very, very ill and very slim. But he built up enough weight and that, and he used to lump the wheat bags from the farmers and build these huge wheat stacks, both at Yinkanni and at Wilpilka. Him and Missy, as I mentioned before, ran the Moorook store, which was a licensed venue. A lot of the guys after work would like to go down and have a beer. So he had let them open a long neck bottle in his back shed. Remember, the long necks was Southwark or West End in those days. and all the long necks came in wooden crates. So the guys would grab one of the wooden crates, stand up on its end. That was good rear end height to sit down and sip a beer. But they always left this garage door open, and some of the other people in the town that didn't like this boozing in front of people rang up the Barmah police, who were controlling Moorook at that stage. Oh, they're drinking and no, shout again. So, yeah, we'll investigate. So the police would hop in the car at Barmah, drive down to the punt at Kingston, cross over. Willie Hatch, who was on the punt at Kingston, what are you guys doing? Oh, we're going over to Cassius at Moorook. Had a report they're boozing in his shed again. Oh, so he'd open the gates, let them off, walk up to the top of the punt landing, get on the phone. Hey, Norm, just put the Barmah police over the punt. Thanks, mate. Drop in next time and I'll give you a beer. Okay. So Norm will go out to the back shed. Hey, fellas, the cops are coming. Get down the river. So they'd take whatever they had left in their long net, walk down to the river, sit down there and drink away. The police would come along. Mr. Kazolki, it's reported that people are drinking beers in your store and you're not licensed for that. Oh, I don't know anything about that. Come out and have a look. Go out to the back shed. Can't see anyone here. Oh, must have been a false alarm. So, I'll see you. Thanks for coming, fellas. The police would then drive off to Berry, Loxton, back to Berry, cross the punt at Berry. The guy there knew the coppers from Barmah, have a talk to them, and then you get up there, ring up Norm. Just Berry punt here, we'll just put the Barmah coppers over. Norm will get out there, hey, come on, you can come back. So, yeah. Yeah, so that's just a little story on the lighter side. But probably one of the best things that has happened in Moorook is the riverfront development. It was a real rubbish dump back in whatever year I said there. And I was lucky enough to be one who helped work on that development. We cleaned up tons of rubbish, barbed wire, fences, everything. Took it out to the then established proper rubbish dump. We put in pipelines so the water running down the slope in Moorook wouldn't wash the sand away, it'll go back into the river. There's been a beautiful community involvement which has helped establish that. We had a bank manager at the State Bank, Laurie Oathens. After he knocked off work, he planted a couple hundred trees and he'd water them with his 2-gallon bucket every other night. It's such dedication. And I'm proud to be part of that community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that informative talk all about our nearby town, Moorook. Very interesting. We pass through it a lot of times. You don't realise some of the history and that goes on in those places, and we really appreciate your effort in putting that together tonight, Jeff, and illustrating that to us. We'll move straight on then to our second speaker for this evening, John Gladigo. Many of you know John. John was born in Loxton and lived on his parents' farm at Allawoona and still resides there today. He was educated at the Brownsville Area School and completed Year 10. In 1987, he lived and worked for 7 months on a grain farm and cattle ranch in Montana, USA, 30 miles from the Canadian border. In 2007, John was awarded a Nuffield Farming Scholarship and spent 16 weeks travelling to the United States, New Zealand, Canada, the United Kingdom, Brazil and Europe, studying collaborative farming. This eventually led in 2009 to the formation of his own and his partner's collaborative farming enterprise, Bullaburra. John is a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and is a director of Grain Producers of South Australia. He completed the executive program for agricultural producers in Austin, Texas in 2020. The Challenge of Rural Leadership course run by Dookie College in Devon, UK. John is married to wife Bronnie and has 2 children, Jaden and Amy. His interests and hobbies include creative writing, social media blogs, music, travel, having flown over 280 plane flights by his own admission. And he admits himself to be a statistical nut. His community involvement has been writing and producing the Little Town Productions in Loxton. He's past chairman of the Brownsville Agricultural Bureau, St Peter's Lutheran Church, and is currently treasurer of the church at the Loxton Show, Loxton Futures Forum, the Brownsville Centenary Committee, and to quote John, anything else that I managed to get roped into. We look forward to John's presentation, Changes Through the Ages, highlighting revolutionary changes of farming since it began in Loxton and the surrounding districts. Ladies and gentlemen, John Gladigo.
Thanks very much, Trevor, for the introduction, and it's wonderful to be off the cedar briefly to be with you here tonight. As Trevor mentioned, I'm a 3rd-generation farmer from Alawoona, where my family have been farming since my grandparents left their apple orchard in Gumaraka with their 4 sons and a daughter in 1956, searching for the land of milk and honey to pursue their farming dreams. And they ended up in Alawoona. There are people who would argue that our family is still relative newcomers to the district, having only been here for 65 years. I'm married to Bronnie and have 2 children, Jaden and Amy, and we were brought up in our original family homestead, which was built in 1926. Some would say that the definition of child abuse has been left the family farm, but it has been a wonderful life for me and my family. In 2009, we joined together with Robin and Rebecca Schaefer to form the collaborative farm Bullaburra, which this year is cropping a little over 9,000 hectares or 22,000 acres. When Trevor Filkey asked me to speak to you tonight about some of the biggest changes and innovations in farming in the Northern Malleyton settlement, it was really hard to know where to start. So maybe stupidly, I did a poll on both Twitter and Facebook where I mentioned I was doing this talk tonight and asked people to vote on what have been the biggest advances and innovations in ag in Australia in the last 100 years. The post went viral, had over 150 comments on Twitter and 1,300 votes in a poll on Facebook. In fact, the whole concept of being able to do a poll of thousands of farmers and instantaneous within 2 hours to reach over 50,000 people and have 2,000 respondents is in itself, I think, quite a remarkable change in our history. And being social media, people were very forthright in their views and were convinced that their choices need to be much higher up the ladder than were mine. And in fact, mine were definitely wrong. You've got to love social media. But I've come up with my own list of 7 out of the 30 to 40 which were suggested. Now, there's a lot of really important innovations I'd love to include it, but I've had to leave out. So these are the highest ranking items that didn't make it. So the clear number 1 in my poll clearly was glyphosate, the chemical. Sadly controversial in the media, but said in a recent study to be the 2nd biggest innovation in global agriculture since the tractor. I haven't included that as a standalone innovation in my list of 7, but I am going to talk about it a little bit later on. The second one that missed out, but really important, was the breeding of semi-dwarf and drought-tolerant wheats, which have doubled the average wheat yields in this district since 1970. Third one, tractor cabs. Quiet, comfortable and air-conditioned. And you get to listen to the footy, keep your drinks in the fridge, heat up your tea in a 12-volt oven. It can be better than living at home. Number 4, education. The level of education of farmers today, with most young farmers today at a minimum completing high school and many with university qualifications. Number 5 is the increasing prominence of women in agriculture. Unbelievably, up until 1994, women could not legally claim to be farmers in Australia. the law defined them as domestics, helpmates, and farmers' wives only. Thankfully, we've come a long way since then, and we should be very proud that Loxton is the home of Australia's very first Australian Rural Woman of the Year in Debbie Tearley. And I would certainly hate to be the one to tell Deb that she's not a farmer. Farmers are farmers, no matter the gender. Hydraulics, which turned tractors into the type of power sources that horses could never be. And then there's things like the shearing handpiece, poly pipe, the UHF radio. We had no excuses for not being home for dinner. And one which I hadn't really thought about but came up quite high in the poll is lights on farm machinery. It actually meant that farming could become a 24-hour operation. Huge innovation. So, what are the biggest advances and innovations we've seen in the Northern Mallee in the past century? I'm not expecting people to agree with me, but these are my top 7. Number 1, tractors replacing horses. Now, this is a little before my time, but would have to be the biggest fundamental change in our history. Before the tractor, a large part of all farming life was around producing enough feed for 12 months for the horses before you even thought about providing for yourselves. A day in the field meant being up before sunrise to feed and tether the horses to the farm machinery, and then the same again at the end of the day. And hopefully some productive work with the team in between. But the introduction of tractors changed all of that. Today we can fill up the tractor and go, 24 hours a day if we want, with each tractor having the capacity in some cases of 300 to 500 horses each. And the development of tractors themselves have taken huge strides with the addition of hydraulics, power steering, power shift, transmissions, rubber tracks, and the creature comforts, which began with the humble umbrella, but which today extends to air-conditioned cabs, low-noise cabs, stereos with subwoofers, televisions, in-cab fridges, ovens, and even, Mark Ample, coffee machines. Tonight when I leave you, I am heading back out on the Cedar tonight, and I get to hop into my heated cabin, pour myself a coffee, heat up my beef linguine, and catch up on a couple of old episodes of Landline on iView. And when I knock off, I can head home, have a shower, hop into bed without once thinking about horses that I might need for tomorrow. However, as big a positive as it was, not everyone was happy about the introduction of the tractor. I recently came across a copy of the Journal of the Department of Agriculture from 1940, in which there was an article debating the value of the tractor versus the horse by a Dr. A.R. Callaghan. These are a few quotes from the article. I do consider tractors are here to stay, but I do not infer that every farmer should possess a tractor. In fact, nothing could be more disastrous. The unfortunate thing about tractors is that they do not breed. Also, like horses, they have a limited life. And I am very concerned about the so-called advantages of tractors. They enable the farmer to do his work in the least time possible, and he has more time at his disposal. For what? To increase his cropping, buy more land and crop it? Or is it just a desire to be free at weekends and free for days and even weeks on end and become a suitcase farmer? And this, it is a man that has the get-rich glint in his eye and a roving disposition at weekends and in between seeding and harvest that we have to be careful about. Such a farmer is a menace to Australia, and if such men are allowed to monopolise the wheat growing of Australia, then you can rest assured that they will sell our wheat lands to overseas consumers of wheat and pay the tractor companies and oil firms of other countries for the privilege. It's a wonder we ever went away from the horse, isn't it? My second in my list of 7 is the introduction of superphosphate. The Northern Mallee has ancient infertile soils and not helped by sporadic rainfall. It can be a harsh, desolate climate. But the introduction of phosphorus fertilisers in the 1920s was a game changer, along with medics for sheep feed, which doubled as a source of nitrogen for growing crops. Suddenly, when there was adequate rainfall, the land was productive. With the addition of phosphorus and nitrogen, it could grow cereals, grasses, medics, which in turn supported more intensive livestock and other cropping options, including in more recent years, legumes such as field peas, lentils, lupins and chickpeas. Fertilisers and trace elements have been key drivers to successful production in the entire history of farming in the Northern Valley, and just as prevalent today. Phosphorus, nitrogen, sulphur and zinc are all integral to successful production, and understanding soil fertility is a key driver today, as modern seeding equipment can apply fertiliser according to prescription maps, in many cases directly replacing the elements removed by the previous year's crop. Number 3 in my list is the introduction of myxomatosis and calicivirus. In 1956, when our family purchased our family farm at Alawoona for £14,000, or $28,000 today, it was the year of the floods, and the countryside did look like the land of milk and honey. But the first year, 1957, was a devastating drought, which also had a huge rabbit plague which decimated the countryside. From January 1957 to February 58, my dad and his brothers caught 22,000 rabbits, which they sold for £1,600. Today, that would equate to more than $150,000 worth of rabbits. As there was barely any crop and livestock were poor, they essentially lived off the rabbit income during this period. Apparently, my grandfather paid the first year's land interest bill to the bank with cash from spotlighting and trapping income. In 1 month alone, January 1958, they sold 445 pounds of rabbits, approximately $40,000 worth today. In February 1958, they purchased a 1926 Dodge buckboard to go rabbiting for £30, and in the first night caught 29 pounds of rabbits to pay for it. But the rabbits were decimating the countryside. Even when I came home from school in the 1980s, we would budget a significant amount of the crop for rabbits. Baiting, trapping, shooting and ripping were only short-term solutions. It was the introduction of myxomatosis and a few decades later calicivirus which made the difference. I think it's probably difficult for us to be able to calculate how much production was lost in the first 60 to 70 years of farming in this district due to rabbits, which are thankfully manageable today. Personally, all my schoolboy pocket money came from trapping and shooting rabbits, and it helped me buy my first car. I remember one weekend when I set 140 traps on a hill on a Friday night after school, and the following morning caught 112 rabbits, followed by another 80 that night. That same hill today does not have one rabbit warren on it, thanks to myxomatosis and calici. Number 4 on my list, bags to bulk. Honestly, the bag era just wears me out thinking about it. But I guess our ancestors didn't know any different. Bagged wheat, infested by mice, lumped onto trucks, into cedars. At harvest time, harvested into 180 pound or 80 kilo bags, they're manually lumped and sewn up by teams of people, manually loaded onto trucks and carted to railway sidings where they're manually unloaded. They're manually stacked before being manually handled again onto railway carriages for the journey to the end user. All of which was back-breaking work. All of which took weeks and even months. In the 1960s, there were still farmers sewing up and transporting bags of grain to sidings in February and March, grain which was exposed to the elements to that point and at risk of mice, weevil, weather damage and spoil. Enter bulk. It changed everything, from transport to seeding to harvest to marketing. Compare with today. In the 1960s, our farm had an average production of around 3,500 bags of wheat and barley per year. That is just under 300 tonne. Today at Bullaburra, we would expect to harvest on average 300 to 400 tonne of grain per day. That grain is directly carted to the Tukiota grain silo in 55-tonne road train loads. Within hours of delivery, I can literally sell it in a phone call or online and have the money in my bank within 3 to 5 days. Bulk handling changed farming in the Northern Mallee as we know it. Number 5 on my list is no-till and conservation ag. Conservation ag essentially began in the 1980s with the introduction of the blade plough, and then the rod weeder and the prickle chain, and ultimately the no-till seeder. Prior to this, most broadacre cropping was based around tillage of the soil in order to manage weeds and disease. And having the ability to till the soil usually meant having to find a way to remove the residues in some way. This usually meant large-scale whole-of-paddock burning, harrowing of paddocks and burning the rows, or continuous cultivation to break down those residues in order to get through at seeding time. Managing weeds, especially grasses, was all based around cultivation. It was not unusual for a paddock to be cultivated 3 to 4 times or more prior to planting the crop, with additional harrowing after seeding for a final grass kill before the crop emerged. These practices, while very effective, also led to massive issues with erosion. Using traditional tillage methods, there was not generally the confidence to sow a crop until there'd been a significant rainfall break. And then we as a district held our collective breaths until July, August, until we were confident that everything was covered and wouldn't blow away. Enter glyphosate, and with it, no-till and conservation ag technology. Glyphosate is a non-selective herbicide which effectively works through the plant to kill it and then breaks that plant down in the soil. It is effectively as combined with no-till seeders, which have the ability to sow through thick residues, in many ways replace tillage as a means of controlling weeds on Northern Mallee farms, which in turn means more residue is retained on the soil surface, meaning less erosion, less dust storms, and most importantly, significantly reducing the loss of valuable topsoil. It's a topic we could talk about for hours, but Northern Mallee farmers have been at the forefront globally of the development of no-till practices and conservation ag in the last few decades, and we probably, as a community, haven't really recognised that. It's interesting that I've recently had a number of older people tell me that the droughts today are nowhere near as bad as they were in the past. That here in Loxton we used to have years with continual dust storms, day after day after day, and there were droughts when farmers grew nothing. What we have today aren't droughts. In fact, we haven't had a drought for years. I beg to differ. The driest 6 years in the last 100 at Alawoona were 1927, 1957, 1982, 2002, 2018 and 2019. The combined years of 2018 and 2019 was the driest 2-year period in our history. And that was on the back of a poor year in 2017. And yet while we made huge losses in those years because of our cost of production today, in those 2 years, we still grew what would have been above average crops prior to 1980. And there were not the dust storms through the town because of our changed farming practices. The technology of no-till seeders also allows us to sow dry, which we're doing right now, and harvest water when it does eventually rain. Our seeders create furrows which channel rainfall directly to the seed, which effectively means we increase the amount of rainfall available to the plant. I posted this picture on social media in 2019. It shows exactly the same paddock in 1982 and 2019. Both years had exactly the same rainfall, within a millimetre. The difference is our farming practices, which has changed this district significantly. My number 6 is related to it. GPS and precision ag. The turn of the new millennium brought with us this new technology called GPS. It was before you got your GPSs in your cars. using satellites in the sky, and we had no idea how it would impact agriculture here in the Northern Mallee. Initially, we thought it was just a gimmick or a toy with little practical use, but it has changed agriculture as we know it. With GPS initially came auto steer, enabling a tractor, sprayer or harvester to effectively drive itself along a predetermined line. Initially, it was within 1 metre of accuracy, then 30 centimetres. Today, we are at 2 centimetres accuracy. The seeder I hop back onto tonight will be overlapping each run by no more than 2 centimetres on a 2 kilometre run. The initial benefit of this is obviously efficiency and savings on fuel, chemical and seed. Historically, it was always accepted that a sprayer would overlap by up to 10%. A 10% saving on chemical on a farm our size equates to $40,000 to $50,000 a year. But by sowing at an accuracy of 2 centimetres, we can also inter-row sow. We currently sow in 30 centimetre spacing, so each year now, as per the photo, we move across 15 centimetres and sow directly in between the previous year's stubble, providing valuable protection for emerging plants and retaining residues. That picture was coming out of a drought. With this technology, we can now accurately record the yield on every square metre of a paddock at harvest, and then use this map in the seeders at this time of year to control the exact amount of fertiliser and seed we place on each hectare for the new crop, according to soil type and the nutrients removed in the previous year's crop. And our tractors can now talk to each other. In each tractor, header and harvester is a screen which shows exactly not only where it has been, but also others in the paddock. I can set up the tractor so it slows down at the end of a run, lifts the machine out of the ground, does a perfect turn, enters the next row, drops the machine back into the ground at the right time and speeds up again while I eat my beef linguine. And we have a precision sprayer, which has infrared cameras along the length of the boom, which detects the chlorophyll in green plants and sends a message to each individual nozzle, and then only sprays that actual weed. It can pick up with the size of a 5-cent coin. So it only sprays the actual weeds rather than bare ground. During summer now, we are often only spraying 6 to 8% of a paddock, creating savings of over 90% on chemicals, with the obvious economic but also the environmental outcomes. And all our sprayers operate on that 2 centimetre accuracy. And not only that, if the sprayer overlaps anything previously sprayed, the satellites in the sky tell individual nozzles to turn off to ensure that not 1 centimetre is oversprayed, all controlled by the in-cab technology and the satellites in the sky. And my last one I have on my list, maybe it shouldn't be there, but it will be in the future. Because I think one of the biggest innovations has been smartphones. I think when we look back in 10 years' time, we'll look back on this in the same way we look on GPS. The reality is that smartphones have fundamentally changed our lives in everything we do. And agriculture is no different. Gone are the days when we'd get home from work and then have to think about ringing people about a range of things. We are now instantly accessible. I talk to people all day. I'm doing business all day. I deal with emails as I receive them, so I can be up to date at all times. When I go home at night, I can literally switch off if I want. But my phone is also my weather forecaster. I have at least 6 weather apps on my phone, so surely one of them could tell me what's going to happen this week. I can watch the weather approaching on the radar. I can pay bills with my phone. I'm instantly alerted when a load of grain arrives at the silo. I can then immediately hit a button and sell that load of grain on my phone. I can take a photo or dozens and dozens of photos of an issue on a machine and send it straight to the repairer. Quite often we'll send it to the US and they tell us what's wrong and come back to us. I can take photos of a weed or crop problem and send them to my agronomist and receive an instant paddock response. I can track all of my machinery. I can hop out of bed tomorrow morning and jump on my phone and see how much the seeders have sown overnight, I can also see exactly how much diesel they have in their tanks, so I know if I need to bring the trailer out. I have all my paddock records, paddock maps, rainfall records, chemical records, all in the palm of my hand, along with 10,000 songs and 25 audiobooks to keep me entertained during seeding. Farming in the Northern Mallee has changed dramatically in the last 100 years. Much of it's been for the better, arguably some not so much. The negative impacts on small towns and communities, practical skills and even quality of life is a subject for another time. The bigger question is, what will history throw at us next? What will be the innovations and changes that will continue to revolutionise agriculture in the next 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, as our new history continues to be written? And if you don't agree with my top 7, tough luck. Because I'm taking my smartphone and I'm heading back tonight into my warm tractor cab to crank up Spotify, have some tea and put some more seeds in the ground. And leaving us all to dream what history has taught us and what the future will bring. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, John, for that very informative talk on farming in the Mallee and the changes and the techniques that have occurred over many, many years. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a break. Stand up, have a stretch. We won't get into the refreshments now, otherwise we may not get you back on time. So just mix and mingle a little bit. We're going to, for Peter's talk next, we'll be putting the lectern down on the floor, and so it'll take us just a couple of minutes to set that up. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being prompt and getting back to your seats. We'd like to keep the evening moving. We'll go on to our third and last speaker, and that's Peter McGarry. Peter, well known, of course, here in Loxton over many, many years. Peter was born in Adelaide and lived at Coromandel Valley on his family's pear orchard. Peter is number 3 of a family of 5 boys. He attended Coromandel Valley Primary and Blackwood High Schools. Following secondary school, he studied at Adelaide University of Ag Science, graduating in 1975 with an honours degree in plant pathology. In 1976, he began working at the Loxton Research Centre in his role as a plant pathology research scientist, specialising in diseases of grapes, particularly downy mildew and powdery mildew. In 1991, he was awarded a Churchill Fellowship and studied for 10 weeks at Cornell University in New York. Throughout his working career, he has travelled extensively overseas to the United States and Europe. Peter is married to Carla, and they had 4 daughters and 2 grandchildren, 4 daughters and 2 grandchildren. He and Carla were the authors of Loxton Centenary Trilogy and other history books of the Loxton District. In 2008, he was awarded Loxton Citizen of the Year, and in 2017 received an Order of Australia Medal for community services. His community involvement includes chairman of the Loxton Mardi Gras and now committeeman, the Loxton Historical Village, Loxton Museum of Ag Technology, Life FM Radio, and Loxton Christmas Carols Committee. His other interests and hobbies include, until recently, playing cricket, vintage cars, and mentoring French science students. We look forward to Peter's presentation, Large Oaks, Some Small Acorns. In other words, from small things, big things grow. The history of ideas and innovations out of the Loxton Research Centre. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter McGarry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening all. I don't know how you follow the acts of the guys who've been before, but well done, team. I'm going to talk about acorns and oaks, as has been said. In the meantime, I'd like to thank those who've assisted me in this part of the talk. There'll be countless names I will not mention. If you come to hear your name, you may not hear it, but I'll do my best. An alternative subtitle might be from Little Ideas, National Innovations Follow, and I want to try and give you some idea of the innovations that have followed from research at Loxton Research Centre. If you see me quivering and shaking a little bit, that's Parkinson's. We'll just get on with it. Okay, the history of the centre at Loxton. I'm going to talk about preparations for the centre, the people at the centre, the process of research, productivity of research, and the passing of research. 2 minutes silence, please. I'm also going to talk about a collection, and I hope to show you about the collection of the scientific teams with varying specialities that I'll talk to you about, and their association with colleagues from interstate and overseas, and the contributions of innovations of national and also international standing in horticulture that have come from this place called the Loxton Research Centre. Come on, let's go now and we'll see some of the good news stories that are waiting to be told. So a bit more about the acorns in preparation. If you consider an idea as an acorn put into the ground grows. If the ground is fertile and the research funds are available, this idea can be nurtured and developed, and hopefully developed so fast so that it becomes an innovation which adds and supplements as increases the production and fruitfulness of the crop which has been studied. Once there's an innovation and some activity in an industry, as a result you get more ideas, and so that if that's fostered by research funds, you get further innovation, and the cycle goes on. In preparations for the research centre, it began in 1947 when the 80 acres were set aside in the World War II service land settlement scheme, which is not very often called that. It's otherwise known as the Loxton Irrigation Area, which was opened by the then Premier Mr Playford in 1949. The Berry Experimental Orchard had been established in 1911 to conduct research and experimentation and to collect and, importantly, disseminate the information back to the growers. If that's not happening, that's like a white elephant. It's no use to anybody. There were 250 blockies planned to come to the Loxton Irrigation Area, and people in the Department of Agriculture had insight and good ideas for the best technology to be developed at Loxton Research Centre for the growing of crops and soils in this district, so that it was truly applicable. In 1960, the first researchers came and began to move from the Berry Experimental Orchard to the Loxton Research Centre, and the first research officer and manager was Bill Harris. Bill was subsequently in 1962 moved to Adelaide for higher duties in agriculture, happened to be an uncle of mine. In 1960 to 69, the offices and labs were nothing but crowded tin sheds and uninsulated quarters. Some of you, if you're around at the time, will know there's no air conditioning except opening the door, and it's called flow-through ventilation. Of the people at the time, 1962, Dick Hilder came and became the permanent manager for a while, if that's possible. Frank Gathercole was the research officer in Stonefruit. He stayed just for 40 years in his career. Well done, Frank. And here's the young Frank giving a talk to growers on pruning stonefruit, communicating the knowledge that had been learnt. In 1965, Noel Richardson came as a research officer in entomology, that is the study of insects, and you'll hear more about him a little bit later. Jeff Thomas came with Harry Tulloch, Leith Giles, and look at the titles of the subject matter of their disciplines, and you'll see the different disciplines that are assembled as a working team at the Research Centre. Mary Walkup was the first plant pathologist in the South Australian Department of Ag, married Jeff Thomas, so later the Mrs. Thomas. Malcolm Campbell came with an emphasis you can see on insects. Peter Galash came, research officer on citrus. You'll hear more about him later. The brothers Gordon and Murray Harvey provided technical support, and you can read from where they were. Chip Morby came early 1970s, perhaps it's 1975, I might have not got that right. Sorry, Chip. But provided wonderful technical support for stone fruit and vines. More new appointments came. The Loxton Research Centre new building was opened, and what a gem was that. What a palatial quarters this was compared to the tin sheds they worked in before. As soon as it was opened, it was too small. There was overflow. Because there was a flood of new research staff appointed, and they began to fill gaps in the technical expertise, and here we go on a merry-go-round. Graham Sterling came and worked on nematology. Nematodes are very small, worm-like structures you can't see except for a microscope. They were controlled by very, very toxic fumigants. Graham developed with his wife Marcel wonderful biological control without any of these fumigants needed, and Graham went on to for world renown for his work in nematology. Wonderful products from Loxton Research Centre. Keith Watson, you'll hear more of him later, on irrigation extension. Geoffrey Finesse, I think, is here tonight, working on insects. You'll hear from him, or about him. Peter Dry in plant pathology, started some work on grapevine diseases. John McCarthy came in viticulture. Tony Bass, propagation. Can you see the team building in the different disciplines that are welding together here? Tony Bass worked from 1970 to 2007, growing nursery plants for the research team in citrus and stone fruit and vines. Wonderful contributions necessary for research. In 1972, Philip Nicholas came, replacing John McCarthy, who'd left, and Phil Cole came working on soils. Wonderful work coming there. And yet more. I think they're steak knives, but I'm not sure. From 1970 to 76, there were 7, or was it 8, new research officers and technical support staff. Several had come and gone, but they were replaced. Amazing trend, not to be sustained. Later, if they went, they're gone. By 1977, there was some stability had been achieved in the team at the Research Centre. I'm just going to whip through this at the moment. This is the team. Yeah, Jeff hasn't changed at all. If we take this as a baseline, we've got the team of 1977. Now I'm going to try and point, and I'm going to have trouble here. Just look at the signs as they come through, perhaps. We've got Margaret Burden working on nematology, who replaced Graham Sterling. Graham had gone to California for 3 years to do further study on nematology before returning. Dick Henderson at the back there came from California to work in the Riverland, introducing new vegetable crops, did wonderful work, later sustained by Shirley Sylvia. Peter Galash, with the beard there, you'll hear more of him later. Barb Orick, typist receptionist in the days pre-computers, where we would write out our reports and she would type them, and days before fax machines and all manner of other things, a critical component of a research team. Philip Nicholas in the back row there working on vines. Ian Bond, full-time manager at that point, and was the one who introduced crops such as pistachios, and had a lot to do with street planting of trees in town, followed on by David Kimber and others. Well done, Ian, great work. At the back, Tony Bass and propagation. We've then got the entomology quartet, Geoffrey Finesse, Andrew Delane, Clive Westbrook and Peter Bailey. And then you've got Trevor Glenn hiding up the back, if you can see. I'll try pointing again up there. Working in the laboratory doing leaf and soil analyses, critical to the research projects and as a community service for the growers. In addition, we've got the stone fruits, Frank Gathercole and Chip Morby. Chip's here tonight. And then you've got, where we got this? Plant pathology, Malcolm Wachtel, the young Malcolm in here, had to work up and put up with Peter McGarry, the plant pathologist. There was an irrigation... Yes, that's right. Wonderful working with Malcolm. The irrigation group was in the mill lab because they couldn't fit into the research centre building, and they worked out of cramped quarters in the old flour mill laboratory, some of you will remember. Then there was a group also in the government offices. Richard Woods here tonight. He worked with soils and agronomy along with others in administration, and the government officers moved to the research centre just after 1981. When extensions to the research centre were built. Some of the clerical staff who've undergirded the work here, we've got Karina Sherpig, Sally Tearley, Jan Powell, Kayleen Nicolai and Joe Rogers. Not to forget, of course, Bev Scarf and Daphne Polymiadis. Critical to the research team, we needed to have staff such as these folk who did wonderful work for us. Community benefit of the research centre, I thought I'd just chuck this in to consider. The Research Centre, Mill Lab and Government Office staff in our benchmark year will say 1977, involved some 25 or so research and extension staff, only 8 were Loxton born. Interestingly, most came to Loxton because of their jobs in research, in agriculture and the facilities that were there. Wonderful things. Most built their careers and stayed for 10 to 15 years or more. Frank Gathercole worked for 40. He chose to stay, as many others did, in their retirement and called Loxton home. And a number have been very active in the community. Perhaps chief amongst them would be the late Pat West, who did wonderful work in the government offices and subsequently the research centre when she moved there. Did wonderful work leading the administration team, and many of you would know the work she did around Loxton Vale, Pat West. What is research, you might ask? What goes on? I thought it expedient to just give you a brief chat about the research. Is by definition making a careful and systematic inquiry or investigation. Put another way, researchers think. Strange substance that really. And if you think, you might come up with an idea. If you come up with the idea, you then need to plan, read and discuss that idea with colleagues, with others elsewhere around the place and globally. In the early days we had to do that by translating papers from French and German, not an easy matter. So think, plan and do, then review, and then why not rethink and plan, read, discuss and do. Certain similarity about that. Then review, would you believe? Until you hope to get to the aha moment. I see, now we understand something about we did not know before. And the aha moment can lead to adapting that to the local environment, and indeed, if it's successful, adoption. And you need to press through for all of those phases. So if we take the idea planted as the acorn, if we nurture the idea through research projects, we can come to the aha moment and the innovation that can then change a production system and can change Australia's economy. Let's talk about horticultural crops, because that was what primarily happened in the research centre. Horticulture is working on citrus, grapes, apricots, peaches, almonds, vegetables, and it's about a list as long as your arm. There are 3 levels of research I'd like to put to you just to think about for a moment. Level 1 is how a plant works on the inside. This could be called crop physiology, how the different cells and tissues work within the plant. It's the study of plants in the laboratory and glasshouse, detailed understanding of things. Level 2, how a plant works on the outside. This could be called crop production, how the plant grows and produces fruit in the orchard or vineyard level. Involves the study of trees and vines in the research centre test blocks or on growers' blocks. And we are very grateful over the years for the involvement of many growers working with us as a team while we did their experiments on their place at their cost and their problem. But with the interaction from the growers and from the researchers to the growers, allowed for rapid adoption or abandonment if the project failed. Level 3 is how the crops grow in the district. If it works on an orchard block, what about the rest of the region or even indeed interstate? And so this is a study of plants in many orchards and vineyards. So the 3 levels of research. I'd like to use the citrus industry as an example to show you what that means in part. So let's review an idea and an innovation or two. Investigating the growth, the production, the yield, the quality of citrus in the modern era at the Loxton Research Centre. This was done by Peter Galash and his team. The citrus, just to be clear, includes oranges, mandarins, grapefruit and lemons. Orange, to be specific, includes Valencias and navel oranges. So in researching citrus at level 1, the thought came, small fruit do not sell well and are unproductive. Now, before you get carried away, Blind Freddie would know that, of course. But the thought then, or the idea is, let's try to increase the sizes of oranges on a tree. Now, there's a challenge for us. So experiments were planned, reading was done, discussion on other systems showed that there was a balance of plant hormones in the sap of citrus trees that controls how long an individual piece of fruit stays connected to the tree. So experiments were undertaken and Peter sprayed specific hormones that modified that balance to see what could be done. And in doing those experiments to cause some, but not all the fruit to fall. It's called thinning the crop, which you can't do by hand, it's just not economic. So in researching citrus further and reviewing the results, Peter found that the trees produced fewer fruit, that's good, and they were bigger and better. Whew, that's a relief, isn't it now? So level 2 studies were undertaken to do more experiments to fine-tune that process. and assess different rates and timing of sprays of trees in the orchard. Barry and Ian Biddle's blocks and other fruit growers serviced the research team with their blocks. This is John Steed looking at some of the outcomes. And the aha moment came. The system worked well. What a good thing was that. And trees, needed then to be adapted to spray for trees in mini orchards, and this is the level 3 study, where the adaptation was experimented with and processed. The results were more even-sized fruit and yields in Riverland Valencia crops. But not only Valencia crops, but the other citrus also worked well, that process of thinning. This is Don Young looking at some of the good fruit there. In adopting this treatment in many orchards across the Riverland in Australia and other regions, Peter later went on to work with international colleagues to improve citrus using better rootstocks, better fruit varieties, had a lot to do with those, and pruning methods. All of these things worked. Peter had many technical officers working with him. One was Don Young, we've seen, Mark Skews and Mark Staniford here assessing a trial of some of the work that Peter had done. So the results was improved economy for growers in growing citrus and for the Australian citrus industry, an innovation from the Loxton Research Centre. It's going backwards, that won't help. Trying to go forward, aren't we, in life? A couple of other examples, and I'll be brief. Researching irrigation and soil salinity systems led by Keith Watson, Jeff Thomas, Phil Cole and others. Keith was a wonderful innovator, a very clear thinker and a great communicator to the growers. A great chap to have as a colleague at the Research Centre. Phil Cole down there talking to growers about soils, another key factor in the team. So in researching the irrigation systems at the time, they were quite primitive. This is irrigating by flood irrigation. It works really, really well. That's as long as you don't put too much water in, it runs out down the bottom end of the row, or don't put enough in so it doesn't reach the bottom end of the row, or you have too much that goes down to drainage, it seeps away from the roots, or is lost to evaporation, and that's if you can get the water when you want it. But otherwise the system works well. So to the overhead drippers, sprinklers now, that's good because you don't have to furrow the ground to plant them. You see the little trees there, you can imagine how much water they're not getting. And you can imagine in wind where that water goes, not to where the vines are, or the trees, beg your pardon. And salty water on citrus burns leaves and causes loss of yield. So otherwise that was a pretty good system too. So research into this process involved looking at soil types and their different capacity to hold water. It involved looking at crops and their different requirements for water. You know, if they're vines, how much water they need. If they're citrus, how much do they need? And they're not all the same. In fact, they're all different. Surprise, surprise. It's involved looking at sprinklers and their delivery of water to the roots, how to get overlapping sprinkler patterns, get even patterns, and to make the sprinklers work well. Are they overhead sprinklers or are they low throw sprinklers? Then came plastics, and we've already heard about that tonight, about the role of plastics and the simple plastic pipe. Sprinklers and drippers were made of plastic. People from Israel came and worked with the team in Loxton and vice versa, and they adapted sprinklers and designed sprinklers and drippers and emitters that we take for granted these days. Monitoring the weather was needed to determine the need to irrigate. How much did it rain last week? How much was it going to rain tomorrow? How much water came into the soil profile? Are we flooding now? Are we pushing water out the bottom? We need to know all of these things. Methods were needed to advise growers of when and how much to apply it. Having got the science organised, we needed to be able to communicate that to the growers. And so the Irrigated Crop Management Service was established, and that was a huge process all by itself. I won't go into that. Suffice to say that Riverland and Israel now lead the world in irrigation efficiency because of this team of your colleagues in the Loxton Research Centre. And it spawned the establishment of irrigation shops across rural Australia, transmitting and transferring this technology. The first in Australia was the Loxton Irrigation Centre, Phil DeThoit and team. Fantastic work out of the Loxton Research Centre, not often touted. Biocontrol of citrus pests, another wonderful success story, led by Noel Richardson and others, and Ron George, some of you would know. This is Noel working in a glasshouse, I can't remember the girl's name, with growing insects. Red scale of citrus was a major pest in Riverland orchards in the 1960s. Fruit like that doesn't sell particularly well. Looks like it's got chicken pox or something. Wonder why it doesn't sell. Research into this found we wanted to try and reduce high volumes of highly toxic pesticides which were being used through spray machines like that. You can imagine the difficulty of spraying a tree, a mature tree, such as that, and high volumes of water were needed. You have to trot back to the fill-up tank every so often. It's a very slow process, but the problem was the sprays weren't working. They were losing ability to control the scale, and there were real problems here. One of another problems was these sprays were inducing secondary pests by killing out the good bugs, and the bad bugs were multiplying. The Loxton Research Centre built an insectary in 1968 through their own efforts, particularly. There's a story behind that. And there they introduced a tiny wasp to feed on the scale insects. This is a scale. You can see it's like a tent over the insect which is breeding underneath that tent. Can you see coming out of that on the right-hand corner a tiny wasp that's emerged? It's been laid, the eggs have been laid inside that tent. The larvae have hatched, they've eaten the scale insect, and that's died and it's lived. So the wasp comes out and goes on and does the process and goes to the next scale insect. Wonderful work. This provided almost complete control without spraying. And it spawned the development of the biological control industry, now being carried on so wonderfully well by James Altman, who took over from Ron George, who as a grower working with the research centre staff got the system working so well. And James has taken that technology on and selling biocontrol agents across Australia into Southeast Asia. You don't hear from James much. I don't know if you're here tonight, James, but he's a very quiet chap, does absolutely wonderful work, and I've asked you to go and talk to him about it later, if you don't mind, James. Researching spray technology was led by Geoffrey Finesse. Spray plants were very inefficient and often ineffective, like that for argument's sake. If you're on the ground there, I reckon you get pretty wet. A lot of these sprays would be past runoff, hit the ground, be wasted completely, polluting the environment. So research into this led to radical redesign of spray technology, and this machine delivers very low quantities of water in a high mist that covers the foliage nicely. Each red item there is a fan which has got a converging airflow, and where the converging air meet, there's turbulence and the leaves go this way and that way, this way and that way, getting sprayed nicely both sides very efficiently, and allows for much more targeted disease and pest control. So much more efficient spraying and achieving spray coverages for much more accurate control of the diseases or pests. This spray technology is unparalleled in world horticulture. Less chemical has now been applied in vineyards and orchards with improved control of target pests and diseases for cleaner, greener cropping systems. Passing of research. Workers in agriculture comprise less than 1% of the Australian workforce. It'd be good to have a little discussion about that and see what you thought about that figure. But 1% of the Australian workforce is not going to have a very significant voting control. Most people won't know about agriculture firsthand. So squeaky wheels get the precedence in government and other circles. That is more money for education, more money for health, more money for roads. Agriculture. So from around the 1990s, who knows when, the South Australian government began cutting back on research budgets. Didn't hear a squeak, except from the church mouse. This ultimately led to the loss of all research at the research centre, except for one, at the once bustling facilities. The Loxton Research Centre has become virtually the Loxton Centre. But though the researchers may have been taken out of the centre, no one can take away the innovations and achievements for the industries that these scientists so ably served. And a closing comment. There's lots more good news about innovations at the Loxton Research Centre. Could go on all night. Time does not permit more than what we've just done, and won't we be able to discuss innovations in other disciplines. For example, the Riverland grape industry. It's the biggest grape industry in a region in Australia. the stone fruit industry or the vegetable industry or whatever other industries, and neither the collaboration triggered with high-ranking universities in eastern USA when the Loxton Research Centre plant pathologist married a Midwestern American school teacher in Loxton who said history ain't boring. Thank you.
All right, that concludes our three speakers' talks for this evening. Quite a diverse range of topics which were, even though centred a little bit on agriculture, we felt it was a topic that we hadn't dealt with before in previous nights, and we hope that tonight brought out some of the different facets of what we see here in the Riverland, and particularly at Loxton in regard to the irrigation as well as to the dryland farming. Rose, would you come forward please with your little presentation to these gentlemen here for their effort for tonight. Very difficult to say a thank you to them for the work and effort that they put in, but I think the little rewards that we give them hopefully will be a token of appreciation from us to you, and that the way that we have accepted you, the way that you spoke tonight and presented the topics in the manner that you did. So just finishing off then, just to highlight again the ordering of DVDs and CDs. There's generally quite a good demand for them. We'd ask you again to have the orders into the library by this Friday to be picked up by the 17th of this month, all going well. There won't be a question time, as I mentioned earlier, but we certainly would encourage you to stay behind after the completion of the evening. The feedback sheets, if you could avail yourselves of those, anybody that would like to, we'd be interested as a small committee just to hear some comments that we could take on board. I would say that although our numbers tonight are down from previous years, we've been delighted as a committee for the number of people that have made the effort to come along here this evening. We certainly thank you for your attendance, and we look forward to the 10th annual event on May the 3rd, 2022. Tea and coffee and refreshments are now served, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much again. Good night.